For years, many English learners believed the same thing. If I learn more grammar, my English will improve. So they buy grammar books, watch grammar lessons, study grammar rules, memorize structures, complete exercises, and after months, sometimes even years, they discover something frustrating. They know a lot about English, but they still struggle to speak it. And that's where the confusion begins. Because grammar is important, very important, but grammar alone doesn't create fluency. In fact, some of the most frustrated English learners in the world are grammar experts. They know the rules, but they can't use them naturally in real conversations. It's like reading books about swimming for 3 years and then being surprised when you still can't swim. Today, we're going to explore why studying grammar all day won't make you fluent, what fluency actually requires, and how successful English learners use grammar differently. Hello, my amazing students, and welcome again to your channel. My name is Clara, and in this episode, you'll improve your English listening skills, vocabulary, speaking confidence, and English fluency while discovering one of the biggest myths in language learning. So let's begin. Most English learners don't have a grammar problem. They have an exposure problem. And understanding that difference can completely change the way you learn. Now think about how children learn their first language. Nobody gives a 3-year-old a grammar textbook. Nobody explains present perfect tense. Nobody teaches conditionals. Nobody says, "Today, we're going to study sentence structure for 3 hours." Yet somehow, children become fluent. Not because they studied rules, because they experienced the language. They heard it again and again and again. Thousands of hours of listening, thousands of conversations, thousands of real examples. And slowly, their brains started recognizing patterns naturally. Now here's something fascinating. The human brain is incredibly good at detecting patterns, much better than most people realize. That's how you learned your first language, not through memorization, through exposure. Now let's connect this to English learners. Imagine 2 students. The first student spends 2 hours every day studying grammar rules. The second student spends 2 hours listening to podcasts, watching videos, reading stories, and having conversations. After 1 year, who do you think sounds more fluent? In many cases, it's the second student. And that's surprising for some people, because the second student may actually know fewer grammar terms. They might not even know the names of certain structures, but they can use them, naturally, automatically, without stopping to think. And that's the key difference. Fluency is not knowing the rules. Fluency is using the language without constantly thinking about the rules. Now here's where many learners get trapped. They believe more knowledge automatically creates more fluency. So whenever they struggle, they study more grammar. Whenever they hesitate, they study more grammar. Whenever they make mistakes, they study more grammar. And eventually, they know hundreds of rules. But speaking still feels difficult. Why? Because speaking and studying are different skills. Reading about football doesn't make you a football player. Reading about driving doesn't make you a driver. Reading about English doesn't automatically make you fluent. Eventually, you have to use the language. Now here's something interesting. Many learners treat grammar like a destination. But grammar is actually a tool, a very useful tool, an important tool, but still a tool. The goal isn't grammar. The goal is communication. Grammar exists to support communication, not replace it. Now imagine someone trying to learn how to play the guitar. They spend 3 years studying music theory, scales, chord structures, musical terminology. But they rarely touch the guitar. Would they become a great guitarist? Probably not. Because performance requires practice, and language works exactly the same way. Now let's go deeper. One reason grammar feels productive is because it's measurable. You can finish a chapter, complete an exercise, get a correct answer. That feels satisfying. Listening and speaking feel messier. Progress is harder to see. But that messy practice is often where fluency develops. Because fluency grows through repeated exposure to real language, not isolated rules. Now, here's a powerful realization. Native speakers make grammar mistakes all the time, yet they communicate effectively. Why? Because communication is about much more than grammar. It's about understanding, meaning, context, confidence, and interaction. Grammar matters, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. Now, imagine yourself 1 year from now. Instead of spending all your time memorizing rules, you balance grammar with listening, speaking, reading, real English exposure. You hear the language daily. You use it daily. You experience it daily. And slowly, the structures that once felt difficult start feeling natural. Not because you memorized them harder, because you've seen them thousands of times in real situations. That's how fluency develops. Not through knowing more and more about English, but through spending more and more time with English. And that's a lesson many learners discover far later than they should. Because grammar can help you understand a language, but only experience can help you live it. Here's something that frustrates a lot of English learners. They know the grammar. They understand the grammar. They can even explain the grammar. But when it's time to speak, their mind goes blank. And they start wondering, what's wrong with me? The answer is simple. Nothing is wrong with you. You're just confusing knowledge with skill. And those are not the same thing. Now think about driving a car. You can read an entire book about driving, study every traffic sign, memorize every rule, pass every written test, and still feel nervous the first time you're behind the wheel. Why? Because knowledge and performance are different skills. One lives in your mind, the other lives in your actions. And English works exactly the same way. Now imagine a learner who knows every grammar rule about the present perfect. They understand when to use it. They can complete exercises correctly. They can explain it to another student. But then someone asks a simple question. Have you ever traveled abroad? And suddenly, the learner freezes. Not because they don't know the grammar, because speaking requires much more than grammar. It requires speed, listening, confidence, vocabulary, pronunciation, and the ability to build sentences in real time. That's a completely different challenge. Now here's something fascinating. Fluent speakers don't usually think about grammar while speaking. They simply speak. The structures appear automatically. Just like you don't consciously think about every movement when walking, you simply walk. That automatic ability is what fluency really is. An automatic ability comes from repetition, not analysis. Now let's go deeper. Many learners spend years strengthening their knowledge system, but very little time strengthening their communication system. So when they finally try to speak, it feels difficult. Not because they're bad at English, because they've been training the wrong skill. Imagine someone spending 3 years studying football tactics. They understand formations, strategies, positions, rules, but they rarely step onto the field. Would anyone expect them to play like a professional athlete? Of course not, because performance requires practice, and speaking is performance. Now here's another important point. Grammar learning is often comfortable. Speaking is often uncomfortable. When studying grammar, you have time. You can think, analyze, check answers, move slowly. But conversations don't wait. People speak. Questions arrive, responses are needed, and your brain must react quickly. That's why speaking feels different. It's a real-time skill. Now imagine 2 learners. The first spends most of their time studying grammar. The second spends most of their time listening and speaking. At first, the first learner might look stronger academically, but over time, the second learner often becomes more fluent. Because fluency grows through usage, not through theory alone. Now here's something powerful. Grammar should support communication, not replace communication. Think of grammar as a map. A map is useful. A map helps you understand where you're going, but eventually, you have to take the journey. Nobody reaches a destination by studying the map forever. At some point, movement becomes necessary. And that's where many learners get stuck. They're preparing endlessly, learning endlessly, analyzing endlessly, but they're not using the language enough. Now here's the truth that changes everything. You do not become fluent by learning about English. You become fluent by experiencing English, hearing it, reading it, speaking it, using it repeatedly, until the language starts feeling natural, until the structures appear automatically, until communication becomes easier than translation. Now imagine yourself 1 year from now. Instead of asking, what grammar rule should I study next? You start asking, how much English did I actually use today? That one question can completely transform your progress. Because fluency is not a knowledge competition, it's a communication skill. And communication skills grow through practice. Not perfection, not endless analysis, and certainly not grammar alone. That's why knowing grammar and speaking fluently are two completely different things. One helps you understand the language. The other helps you live inside it. There's something that surprises many English learners. Some people become fluent without knowing much grammar terminology. Meanwhile, other learners can explain grammar rules perfectly and still struggle to hold a simple conversation. At first, this feels unfair. How can that happen? Shouldn't the person with more grammar knowledge be more fluent? Not necessarily. Because fluency and grammar knowledge are not the same thing. They're connected, but they're not identical. Now think about your first language. Most native speakers cannot explain every grammar rule they use. Ask someone to define every tense, clause, and structure in their language, and many would struggle. Yet they speak fluently every day. Why? Because language is primarily a skill, not an academic subject. Now here's something important. The brain has two very different ways of learning. One system learns information, the other learns skills. Information is knowing, skills are doing, and doing always requires practice. Now imagine someone learning basketball. They spend years reading books about the game, studying strategies, watching coaches explain techniques, memorizing rules. Would they automatically become a great player? Of course not, because understanding basketball and playing basketball are different things. And English works exactly the same way. Now let's go deeper. Many learners accidentally become language researchers instead of language users. They spend hours learning about English, watching explanations, studying rules, analyzing structures. But they spend very little time actually interacting with English, and that's where progress slows down. Because fluency grows through interaction, not observation. Now here's something fascinating. When fluent speakers communicate, they don't build sentences word by word using conscious grammar calculations. That would be too slow. Instead, they rely on patterns stored in their brain, patterns they've seen thousands of times. Patterns they've heard repeatedly, patterns that became automatic through exposure. That's why listening is so important. Listening feeds the brain those patterns. Every podcast, every conversation, every story, every video adds another layer of familiarity, and familiarity eventually becomes fluency. Now imagine two learners. The first learner studies grammar for 2 hours every day. The second learner studies some grammar, but also spends time listening to podcasts, reading stories, shadowing speakers, and having conversations. At first, the difference may be small, but after a year, something interesting happens. The second learner often develops a stronger instinct for the language. They start feeling what sounds natural, not because they memorized more rules, because they experienced more English. And experience changes the brain differently than study. Now here's another powerful truth. Children don't become fluent because they understand grammar. They become fluent because they're surrounded by language. The brain learns through massive exposure, through repetition, through context, through real communication. And adults still learn many language skills the same way. Now don't misunderstand this. Grammar matters. Grammar helps. Grammar makes communication clearer. But grammar should support fluency, not replace fluency practice. Think of grammar like the skeleton of a body. Important? Absolutely. But a skeleton alone doesn't create life. You also need muscles, movement, energy, practice. And English works the same way. Grammar provides structure. Exposure creates fluency. Now imagine yourself 1 year from now. Instead of spending all your energy trying to master every grammar rule, you spend more time listening, more time reading, more time speaking, more time living inside the language. Slowly, English starts feeling less like a school subject and more like a real communication tool. That's when something beautiful happens. You stop translating everything. You stop analyzing every sentence. You stop worrying about every tiny mistake, and you start focusing on meaning, connection, communication. Because that's what language was designed for in the first place. Not perfection, communication. And the learners who understand that often reach fluency much faster than those who spend years trapped inside grammar books. Because in the end, people become fluent through using a language, not through endlessly studying it. One of the biggest fears English learners have is making grammar mistakes. And honestly, it's easy to understand why. School teaches people that mistakes are bad. Tests punish mistakes. Grades punish mistakes. And after years of that experience, many learners start believing something dangerous. If I make mistakes, I'm failing. But language learning doesn't work that way. In fact, some mistakes are actually signs of progress. Now that sounds strange. How can a mistake be a good thing? Because mistakes often prove that you're using the language, and using the language is exactly what creates fluency. Now imagine 2 learners. The first learner speaks every day, makes grammar mistakes, gets corrected, learns, improves. The second learner rarely speaks because they're waiting to be perfect. Who makes more mistakes? Obviously the first learner. But who improves faster? Usually the first learner. Because mistakes create feedback, and feedback creates growth. Now here's something fascinating. A learner who never makes mistakes is often doing one of 2 things. Either they're already fluent, or they're not challenging themselves enough. Because growth usually happens at the edge of your ability. And at the edge of your ability, mistakes are normal, expected, even necessary. Now think about learning to ride a bicycle. Would you expect someone to learn without losing balance? Of course not. Balance develops through imbalance, and fluency develops through imperfection. That's why mistakes should not always be viewed as failures. Sometimes they're evidence that learning is happening. Now let's go deeper. Many learners spend so much energy trying to avoid mistakes that they stop communicating naturally. Before speaking, they analyze every sentence, every verb, every tense, every structure. And by the time they're ready to speak, the conversation has already moved on. Because communication happens in real time, not inside grammar books. Now imagine a child learning their first language. Children make thousands of mistakes. Thousands! They mispronounce words, use incorrect grammar, create strange sentences. Yet nobody expects perfection. People understand that mistakes are part of development, and eventually, those mistakes disappear naturally through exposure and practice. Adults often forget this lesson. Now here's something powerful. Many fluent speakers became fluent while making countless mistakes. The difference is that they didn't stop because of those mistakes. They treated them as information, not evidence of failure. Information, something useful, something temporary, something that would improve with time. Now let's connect this to English listening. Every time you listen to English, your brain is collecting patterns, the correct structures, the natural expressions, the common sentence forms. And over time, those patterns start replacing mistakes automatically. Not because you memorized every rule, because your brain saw the correct form thousands of times. That's one reason listening is so powerful. It teaches grammar naturally through repetition. Now, here's another important truth. People care much less about your grammar mistakes than you think. Most listeners focus on understanding your message, not analyzing every sentence. If communication is clear, many small mistakes don't matter nearly as much as learners imagine. Yet, overthinkers often believe the opposite. They think one grammar mistake will ruin everything. But real conversations aren't grammar exams. They're communication. And communication is about connection. Now, imagine yourself 1 year from now. You speak more, listen more, read more, practice more, and because of that, you make more mistakes. But you also make more progress, because every mistake teaches something. Every conversation teaches something. Every interaction teaches something. And little by little, your English becomes more natural, more automatic, more fluent. Not because you avoided mistakes, because you learned from them. That's why making grammar mistakes is often a sign that you're moving forward. The people who never make mistakes are often standing still. The people who improve are usually the ones brave enough to keep speaking anyway. And sometimes, a mistake is not proof that you're failing. It's proof that you're learning. So if studying grammar all day won't make you fluent, what will? That's the question that really matters, because after everything we've discussed, it's important to be clear. This episode is not an attack on grammar. Grammar matters. Grammar helps. Grammar makes communication clearer and more accurate. The problem begins when learners expect grammar to do a job it was never designed to do. Fluency. Fluency comes from something bigger, something more practical, something more human. Experience. Now, think about your closest friend. How did you become comfortable talking to them? Did you study them for 3 years? Did you memorize information about them? Did you read books about friendship? Of course not. You spent time together, you interacted, you communicated, and comfort developed naturally. Language works in a similar way. The more time you spend with English, the more comfortable English becomes. Now, here's something fascinating. Many learners are looking for a secret, a shortcut, a perfect method, a magical technique. But fluency is usually built through simple things repeated consistently. Listening, reading, speaking, thinking in English, repeating, listening again, speaking again, and gradually, the language becomes familiar. Now let's imagine 2 learners again. The first learner studies grammar for 2 hours every day. The second learner studies 30 minutes of grammar and spends the rest of the time listening, reading, speaking, and interacting with English. Who is more likely to become fluent? Usually, the second learner. Because fluency is built through contact with the language, not just knowledge about the language. Now here's something powerful. Your brain learns patterns through repetition. That's why native speakers don't stop and calculate grammar every time they speak. They've heard those patterns thousands of times, and eventually, The patterns became automatic. That's exactly what English learners need too. Not more rules, more exposure. Now let's talk about listening. Listening is often the most underestimated skill in language learning, yet it's one of the most important. Because every time you listen to English, you're feeding your brain examples, natural pronunciation, natural sentence structures, natural vocabulary, natural rhythm. And over time, those examples start shaping the way you speak. That's why people who listen consistently often improve faster than expected. Their brain is constantly absorbing patterns. Now let's talk about reading. Reading exposes you to vocabulary, expressions, sentence structures, ideas. And unlike grammar exercises, reading shows language in action. Real language, used by real people, inside real contexts. That's incredibly valuable. Now let's talk about speaking. Speaking is where everything comes together. Listening provides input. Reading provides input. Grammar provides structure. But speaking turns passive knowledge into active ability. And active ability is what fluency really means. The ability to use the language when you need it, not just understand it. Now here's another important truth. Fluency is not perfection. Many learners delay progress because they're chasing perfect English, perfect pronunciation, perfect grammar, perfect sentences. But real communication doesn't require perfection. It requires connection, clarity, confidence, and practice. The goal is not to sound like a grammar textbook. The goal is to communicate successfully. Now imagine yourself 1 year from today. You still study grammar, but grammar is no longer the center of your learning. It's a support tool. Meanwhile, you're listening daily, reading regularly, speaking consistently, thinking in English more often, living inside the language. And because of that, English starts feeling different, less like a subject, more like a skill, less like something you study, more like something you use. And that's when fluency starts appearing. Not suddenly, not magically, but gradually. One conversation at a time, one podcast at a time, one page at a time, one day at a time. Because fluency is not created by knowing everything. Fluency is created by using what you know again and again until it becomes natural. And that's the lesson many successful English learners eventually discover. Grammar can guide you. Grammar can support you. Grammar can help you. But grammar alone cannot make you fluent. Only experience can do that. And the good news? You can start building that experience today.